Welcome to the Wealth is in the Details podcast. In this podcast, financial planner Peter Raskin helps families and business owners understand and prepare for their wealth journey. Along the way, thoughtful and detailed planning can provide clarity and confidence as clients confront a multitude of financial decisions. Listen in as Peter shares stories and insight into people's wealth journeys. Now, let's get into today's podcast.
Hello and welcome to Wealth is in the Details with Peter Raskin from Raskin Planning Group. Peter, how are you today?
I'm doing fine, Eric. How about yourself?
I am doing fantastic. It's a new year today.
Good. Yeah.
Not just this day. It's been a new year for a little while, but it is a new year. And in past podcasts, you've described an annual family stewardship checklist, which I loved that conversation. I love the concept. And today you really want to talk about one of those items on the checklist, correct?
Yeah. I thought we'd talk about the purpose of the stewardship checklist, which is about tasks that everyone should be reviewing annually. So I just like the idea of putting certain tasks into my monthly calendar as a reminder of what needs to be done. Because if I don't put it in my calendar, it often doesn't get done. So I put it into my electronic calendar, and then I'm less likely to forget or ignore these things that I want to do. And I always think that the new year is a good time to review those checklists and make any adjustments to tasks or to the timing of these tasks.
Yeah. And like I said, I remember you talking about it. I remember the podcast. I don't remember which number it was. Do you happen to remember so listeners can go back and check it out?
Yeah, it was episode 29, Becoming a Good Steward of Your Finances with a Checklist.
See, that's why you're the numbers guy.
Right.
Yeah.
So the this actual checklist is also on my website, raskinplanning.com, and it's under the resources tab. So if people want to take a look at it, I just excuse the sports analogy, but I think of this checklist, and a lot of checklists are kind of like the blocking and tackling of financial planning. Just like blocking and tackling from a football perspective. These are the basic things that we just need to work on all the time in order to really make sure we're meeting our objectives.
All right. So to follow with that, you're saying that this activity is about making sure others are okay after we pass.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. So this is all about this topic is about what happens to assets when we die.
Okay.
So it's not the most uplifting conversation, but I think it's vitally important, and I hope today's conversation will help our listeners understand why I think it's so important. So I thought we'd start off with just talking about some of the basics from a planning standpoint. So when we die, our assets are going to pass to someone else based on how we own that asset. So let me explain. I can own an asset as an individual, like a bank or an investment account or a house, without a beneficiary designation. So if there's no beneficiary designation on the account, the asset's going to pass to others based on my will or by the state laws. And the state laws are meaning the state I live in, that I'm a full-time resident of. So the asset will go through the estate probate process to make sure that asset's transferred to the person designated in my will, or if there isn't a will, the state's going to determine who gets what, and it's usually the next of kin. So just an important thing to understand: if you don't have a will, there is a method, and it's going to go by the state law. I also can own assets jointly with someone else, like my spouse. So we can each own half of the asset, and at my death, my 50% would pass to my heirs according to my will, or we can own the asset jointly with rights of survivorship. And that means my 50% would pass automatically to my spouse without going through probate.
Okay, so what checklist items are we working on today?
So it's one of the most important ones from that family stewardship perspective. And it's vital that we review our beneficiary and ownership designations on all of our asset accounts. our bank accounts, our investments, our property, our retirement accounts like 401ks and IRAs and annuities, our life insurance, and also look a little deeply at the trusts that have been established, if we have trusts, to make sure that we understand what those beneficiary designations are. So we want to make sure our assets flow to the right person or to the right trust or to the right charity based on our current situation and our thinking at that time that we're reviewing it.
Yeah. Well, Peter, you mentioned probate a little bit ago, and I've learned from you, probate is not a good thing, right? And it should probably be avoided, if I remember right. So isn't joint with rights of survivorship the easy and best ownership option? I mean, that's what it sounds like to me. It sounds good to avoid probate and have the asset pass to someone I want it to.
Yeah, I think a probate can be a problem. The biggest problems that I see is that there are time delays that you have to work through when you're going through this probate process. There's also a lack of privacy because probate is in the public record. There's additional administrative and legal costs, and if possible, probate should be avoided. Mm-hmm. However, there may be good tax and estate planning reasons to actually probate assets. So we don't have the time today to go into all those details, but the bottom line is that we don't always want assets to automatically go to the surviving spouse. It's a good option, but we want to make sure we're doing it correctly. Another way for assets to pass at our death is by beneficiary designation. So we can add beneficiaries to an investment account or a bank account through an ownership designation called transfer on death, or we shorten that to TOD, transfer on death. So we can actually name an individual or individuals, or we can name a trust as a beneficiary on an investment account. And by doing this, we can also avoid probate and transfer the asset where we want it to go. Mm. So I would say, most beneficiary designations allow the account holder to name a primary beneficiary as well as a contingent beneficiary. And some people are unfamiliar with those terms. I'd say most people understand them, but the primary beneficiary is that class of beneficiary chosen first, meaning if the primary beneficiary is alive when the account holder dies, that primary beneficiary becomes the new owner of that asset. If the primary beneficiary dies prior to the account holder, that's when the contingent or the secondary beneficiary becomes the new beneficiary. So it's just an important distinction between primary and contingent or secondary that people need to understand.
Okay.
I thought it would be helpful to just give an example of that, and this can get complicated. Mm-hmm. So just as an example, Jim is single. He has $1 million in an investment account, and he wants his sister Jane to inherit this account at his death. If Jane dies before Jim, he wants the $500,000 split between his two adult nieces, Sally and Sarah. So Sally and Sarah are Jane's kids. The transfer on death or TOD designation can help Jim meet these objectives. Jane's the primary beneficiary, but if she predeceases Jim, the nieces are the contingent beneficiary. Okay. So that's simple. It's pretty standard. But if we change the facts a little bit, you can see it gets a little complicated. So Jim's nieces are teenagers, and in his opinion, maybe a bit immature right now, and he wants them to grow up before they've completed, before they have complete access to any sort of substantial inheritance. So he wants to distribute half of each of their inheritances at age 30 and the remaining amount at age 35. So Jim dies, the nieces become the primary beneficiary because Jane has passed away, mm-hmm. and he wants the kids to get it at 30 and 35, get the assets at 30 and 35. So you can see how an outright distribution to the nieces via just a beneficiary designation doesn't meet Jim's objectives. So the solution might be a trust.
Okay.
So he can name a trust that will hold and manage those funds until the youngest is 35. And then an independent trustee can manage the funds and distribute the cash to the nieces if they have any needs prior to, ages 30 and 35 when they're going to get distributions. So in this transfer on death designation, Jim might name Jane as the primary beneficiary and the trust as the contingent beneficiary.
Okay. So I have a question. In your example, Jim's sister, Jane, has predeceased Jim. She died before him.
Yep.
But so has one of Jane's nieces, Sally, who had 2 children. Will Sally's kids receive Jim's inheritance, or will it all go to Sarah?
That's a great question. And here's where we get much more complicated.
We're getting in the weeds here, bud.
Yeah, we're getting in the weeds. Yeah. But I think it's important from a conceptual standpoint. So Sarah and Sally have become the primary beneficiary when Jane, their mother, predeceases Jim.
Mm-hmm.
So if Jim uses what we'll call a standard beneficiary designation at Sally's death, Sarah will inherit 100% of Jim's $1 million, and Sally's kids are going to be disinherited. And that may not be the solution that Jim wants.
Yeah.
So if Jim wants Sally's kids to inherit Sally's share of the inheritance, he'd have to stipulate a different kind of designation. Instead of that standard beneficiary designation, he'd need to use a per stirpes designation.
Per stirpes.
Stirpes, STIRPES.
Okay.
And it's Latin for by branch.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
So it's a way to think about it. So per stirpes means by branch, which means the beneficiary in inheritance is going to be passed on to the next in line heir or heirs. So in this example, Sally's kids would inherit Sally's share of the $1 million or $500,000, and Sarah would inherit $500,000. So I think that meets Jim's objectives of keeping it within each family.
Yeah.
Another option, another beneficiary designation option is called per capita, different than per stirpe. So per capita means by the heads.
Okay.
So getting deeper into those weeds, it means the beneficiary and inheritance would be divided evenly amongst any surviving beneficiaries. So if you can follow me, following the bouncing ball, in this example, Sally's kids replace Sally as a beneficiary, in effect, and Jim's inheritance would be split equally between Sarah and Sally's 2 kids. So now Sarah and Sally's 2 kids each receive 1/3 of Jim's $1 million.
That doesn't sound good.
Yeah, most times I don't find the per capita designation is appropriate, but I think, you're going to see it on forms. Yeah. If there's a beneficiary form, it may discuss per capita and per stirpes. And that's why I mentioned that. I just think it's good to know.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely good to know. I just think of all the, the possibilities of what could happen. And I'm just going to throw this out there that if Jim passes away and let's say Sally is the older of the 2 nieces and she's had 2 kids and Sarah hasn't had children yet, but she wants to, if all of a sudden that money's split in thirds, Sarah and her extended family and future children basically got ripped off, right? Or they don't get the inheritance that Jim actually designated originally for her. Right. That's just my opinion. I think that would cause a lot of family strife. So I can see why it's not chosen very often. And taking this a little bit further, I would think that Jim, especially depending on the ages, right? Jim might want to have Sally's kids share of the inheritance held in trust, right? Because you talked about having it in trust until their age of majority, or maybe until they're a little older and make better decisions. I mean, that would be my assumption. Yeah,
and that's why I think trusts are such an important tool. They even in simple situations, they can make a lot of sense. In many cases, the beneficiary designations are obvious. for example, a spouse as a primary and then children as contingent. But as you said, what about those? What if the kids are underage? There might be a custodian controlling the account until the kids, those underage kids, become of majority, like 18 or 21, depending upon your state that you live in. Does Jim, as the account owner, really want an 18-year-old or a 21-year-old or maybe even a 25-year-old to come into a big inheritance? A lot of kids just aren't. They're just not responsible and ready for it.
Yeah.
And is that fair to the young person? Maybe they're perfectly capable, but I think that's a consideration. And then how about an adult that has special needs, or it's a child with substance abuse issues, or a child that really is in a bad marriage? Do you really want them to receive significant assets, which could be part of any divorce agreement?
Oh, yeah.
So these are all reasons why I think it's important to review beneficiary designations and to be thoughtful about them. Trusts offer a person a bit more control and flexibility when it comes to passing on assets. And I think they're an important part of planning. And that's why I mention it as part of this overall discussion.
All right. Well, I've got kind of a two-part question, and maybe you'll address this here in a second. But I know IRAs, 401ks, most people have one of those, one or two, or if not both. And they have beneficiary designations, if I'm not mistaken. So that's my first question. Don't they have beneficiary designations?
Yes.
And then secondly, is it possible to put those into a trust? Or is it, if somebody's working and they're still contributing to their 401k and they pass away, obviously that's not in a trust, I would assume, or is there a way to do that?
Yeah, great question. Yes, you can certainly name a trust as a beneficiary of a retirement account, like an IRA or 401k. Absolutely. It's important to review those in light of tax changes or tax law. It's important to review those based upon the objectives. And it may not be the best choice right today because of recent tax legislation. Sometimes we do want to name individuals, but if they're underage, we may want to make sure that our trusts speak to that.
Yeah.
So very important. You do want to look at all the retirement account designations, as well as life insurance and annuity contracts. And so all of this needs to come into the overall discussion.
Got it. All right. Well, Peter, here's my thought as you go through these and you rattle a lot of these things off. You don't have to have the same beneficiary for everything. And I would assume that keeping track of all beneficiary designations for each account has got to be kind of taxing. It's got to be kind of tough for people. Do you find that it's overwhelming for folks?
Yeah, it's frankly, it's a lot of work, especially if you have lots of different accounts, bank accounts, investment, retirement accounts. If you have a lot of insurances, it's a lot of work. And so that increases the complexity. And that's one reason we often suggest that accounts get consolidated wherever it's practical. And part of our process includes confirming ownership and beneficiary designations. And we do this as part of our plan. We put together a summary of ownership and beneficiaries for each account. And then we review these as part of our client annual review. And we provide a summary of the estate planning documents, which also reminds our clients about their estate planning intentions and who the beneficiaries are of certain trusts and wills. And I think it just helps coordinate the client's current situation with their actual wants and desires. And then also we need to coordinate all this with the client's estate planning documents, and then their estate planning attorney. So it just becomes a real important but time-consuming process that I don't find everyone wants to do on a regular basis because it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So I thought it would be helpful to maybe go through a couple of examples of why this conversation can be so important. At least it's a conversation to have each and every year, and that's what we do. A new client that's come to us recently And they came to us with 5 separate transfer on death accounts. Each one was only worth about $10,000. And this is money that they expect will help pay their grandchild's college education. So they've got 5 grandkids.
Okay.
And they named a different grandchild the beneficiary of each account in case our client dies prior to being able to help the grandchild with education. They didn't want to make the grandchildren, the grandchild or their grandchild's parent, the owner of the account, because they didn't want this counting against that family for financial aid purposes. So, well, it met the client's objective. It also caused a problem. So the problem, in my opinion, is, what happens if the client dies before the child goes to college? This $10,000 is going to transfer to the child directly, which means that this is going to affect their college financial aid.
Okay.
And what happens if the kid doesn't go to college? And my client just didn't want the child to receive $10,000 and not use the funds for that purpose. They didn't want them to go buy a car. They wanted it to be used for college. So the $10,000 in the child's name is going to count against financial aid. It's going to give the child more money than they wanted at that point in time. And then I reviewed my client's wills and the trust, and the client could solve this problem just using their existing trusts. So instead of naming the child as the beneficiary of the account, they could just name their trust as the beneficiary.
Okay.
And then their child they've got 2 kids, and each child would then receive 50% of the overall estate. And there'd be plenty of funds there for that child to spend on that grandchild's education. Okay. And this would also be beneficial from a financial aid purpose, because money's left in the parent's name is counted less than if money were left in the child's name.
Got it.
Okay, so I thought that was a better solution. So we had the client's trust as the beneficiary, and that seemed to solve that problem.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, so that's just one example of just doing a review and saying, hey, this doesn't seem right. And here's another example, and I thought this was also is helpful. Existing client, they've got a very large and significant IRA that she inherited from her deceased husband, and her trust is the current beneficiary of this IRA account. And she also has other assets that are non-retirement, and they're owned by the trust, and therefore at her death, the asset stays in the trust. And together we were recently reviewing the beneficiaries of the trust. And it appeared to me that it might be more efficient to name her nieces and nephews individually and directly as beneficiaries of her IRA instead of having the assets flow through the trust. That's what she wanted. And I spoke to the attorney, and he agreed. Based on current tax law, it didn't make sense to have it go through the trust. At the same time as we're reviewing that, the client decided and wanted to change the designations for that trust. She had named a couple of specific charities and wanted to eliminate them. She didn't want to make any more gifts to that charity. She'd already given enough, and it just wasn't appropriate anymore. So she wanted to get more specific about the contingent beneficiaries and what happens if one of her primary beneficiaries passed before others, who would receive it, what families would receive it. And this was all going to be done in the trust as well as through the IRA beneficiary. So I think you could see how that just an annual review led to what I would call a meaningful discussion and changes that met her current objectives.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've seen situations where client objectives were not met because these types of issues weren't resolved.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, it's true. And I'm working right now. We're with a client whose son never engaged us to do any planning. We had some small accounts with us, but never did any planning with us. And he was a part owner in the family business and in commercial real estate that the family owned. And the son's wife had died a couple of years ago, and the son died recently this year. And it was tragic.
Yeah.
He left a son and didn't have any wills or trusts. So he didn't have a will or trust. So everything is now left to my client's grandson, who's in his mid-20s.
Oofda.
And he's struggling. He's got some substance abuse issues. He's got mental health issues. And he's left about $1 million of assets.
Wow.
And he's really struggling with that responsibility. And it's really painful for my client, the grandparent who's looking at this, adores her grandson, but this has just not worked out like they wanted it to. So, lack of planning, the results that were not hoped for.
Yeah, it's like watching a train wreck that just, you have no control, and that's a very, very sad situation. And so, again, I know you well enough. I think you'll agree with this, that thoughtful, deliberate, and annual planning, it's got to be the solution. I really liked your blocking and tackling analogy. And I know these are kind of financial planning basics, but these really seem to make a huge difference in people's lives.
I think so. Engaging a planner, a financial planner, to ask the right questions at the appropriate time, I think just helps a family stay focused on their journey. And, the planners are that guide that's going to help that family arrive at the destination. And this is something that isn't just done once. It's just done on a regular basis, because life is full of changes, and the map gets changed along the way, or the destination gets changed, and we just have to make adjustments. And the planner is often, I think, the appropriate person to kind of bring it back to the objectives and help steer that client toward in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that you're an amazing accountability partner, and that's really what a lot of people need. Even though they may not like to hear everything you have to say every time, you're the voice of reason. You're the one that says, I'm going based off what we've planned for, and these are some of the best options for you. And maybe this isn't a good option. But I like the fact that you're that accountability partner. You're that voice, whether they choose to like it or not. I think it's a powerful place to be, and that's a fantastic part of the role that you play.
I agree.
All right. Well, Peter, thank you so much. This is a great way to kick off the new year, and I appreciate all the time that you spend with me and educating me on this stuff.
My pleasure. It's a lot of fun. Always fun talking to you. So thank you.
Well, I want other people to talk to you too. So how does somebody get a hold of you if they want to, maybe they haven't had an annual review with you, maybe they're with another planner and they want a second opinion? I would love for them to reach out and just say, hey, am I on track? How do they get a hold of you, Peter? Yeah,
I think probably the best way to do it is through our website. Go to raskinplanning.com. There's lots of resources there. We've got all of our podcasts. By the time this one is published, we're probably 73, 74 episodes. Yeah. So there's a lot of information, a lot of things that people can listen to, but also a couple white papers that might be helpful. So please go to the website, and you can reach out to us from there.
All right. Perfect. Thank you again, Peter. And of course, thank you to the listener. Thank you for tuning in and listening to the Wealth is in the Details podcast with Peter Raskin. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Peter comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it really easy to share these podcasts with your friends and family. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at Raskin Planning Group, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth is in the Details podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Lincoln Financial Advisors Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning. Peter Raskin is a registered representative of Lincoln Financial Advisors. Securities offered through Lincoln Financial Advisors Corporation, a broker, dealer, member SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through SageMark Consulting, a division of Lincoln Financial Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Insurance offered through Lincoln affiliates and other fine companies. Raskin Planning Group is not an affiliate of Lincoln Financial Advisors. Lincoln Financial Advisors Corporation and its representatives do not provide legal or tax advice. You may want to consult a legal or tax advisor regarding any legal or tax information as it relates to your personal circumstances.